and tons of people from U.S. aid, but they tend to be all different levels.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a rainy day. We don't seem to have any kind of good weather in this town anymore, so no matter, at least it wasn't a snowstorm. I want to introduce myself. I'm Mark Nelson. I'm Senior Director here at the National Endowment for Democracy in charge of the Center for International Media Assistance. And I want to welcome our very impressive panel and a very impressive audience of people. We're going to be having a conversation, an open conversation this afternoon about the taking stock of where we are in the whole media development field at this very difficult moment when there are so many challenges out there and so many places closing down. We want to step back and look at the whole field and talk a little bit about what the options are in this environment. We're also here to celebrate a bit the launch of our new website, which some of you may have seen and which you can see later on the screen behind us. There's a computer that'll be back there, and we'll be showing some pages from it up above. It's been a chance for us to sort of rethink our strategy and consolidate our thinking a little bit around what our priorities are. And I think it's a really important time for this field because, as I say, there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of challenges out there. I'd like to thank all the people who were involved in putting this together, both and staff as well as Ned and the Forum for Democratic Studies, which has helped us staff this event. And for those of you who are following online, you can follow and contribute to the discussion using the hashtag MediaDev, just MEDIADEV, yeah, and send your questions to @CIMA_media. Your questions will get into the room, and we would really love to receive some questions from people who are observing from online. As I said, we've got some of the leading stars in the media development field with us today, and we're really privileged to have this panel. Sitting here to my left is David Young, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. To his left is Ann Nelson, no relation, of Columbia University, who has been an old CIMA hand and has written a lot on this topic and is a recognized author on the subject. To her left is Harlan Mandel, who is the CEO of the Development Investment Fund. And finally is Jeannie Bourgault, who is president and CEO of Internews and also a really important partner of CIMAs and someone who has known this field starting almost from the beginning. We're here to look at this field, as I said, at a time of enormous political challenges as well as technological change, because it's really upsetting the apple cart in so many ways, and people are having to really work very hard to understand what to do and how to do it. And we at CIMA decided to refocus our work on the media development subject because we think it is really continues to be a really important and relevant concept for the world that we're in right now. Because all of the literature that has linked the role of free media to democratic and economic outcomes focuses on this concept of having good quality local media that is independent and able to cover local events so that people get the information they need to participate in the democratic and decision-making processes. And when that's not there, I think we're just deepening the difficulties that we have. And I think one of the reasons that we want to refocus on this is to try to create the space and discussion about what we're doing, how we're doing it, how it's changed by technology and the kinds of disruption that's going on in the markets. Um, and we also to draw down our focus to 4 critical areas that we want to look at, both that I think describe pretty carefully a lot of CIMA's existing work, as well as create a platform for us to think about the future. And those 4 areas are effectiveness, sustainability, innovation, and funding. Effectiveness being the kinds of work that the people in this room are involved in, helping countries through the international aid system to develop their institutions and to do work, and how effective those are, and how well they work, and what we can learn from them. Sustainability, the whole concept of what kind of business models and what kinds of support that can be taken up and carried on by local people when international assistance is gone. Innovation coming from the side of not only the massive changes in the technology field, but also the innovations that some of you are undertaking in the way you deliver programs, and how innovative they are, and maybe being able to help countries leapfrog into new ways of doing things. To some countries, I think will eventually just skip the whole traditional media and jump immediately into the digital world, for example. So we're looking at innovation from that whole area. And funding, which has been an important area of CIMA's past work and continues to be of enormous interest to people in this field. What are donors doing? What are their priorities? What is the level of funding? What kinds of what countries are we focusing on, and how are we reacting to this major disruption that is going on in this field? So all of this is on our website, and I hope you will find it useful and helpful in being able to find not only our past reports, but the things that we will be working on in the future. So I want to start what will be a kind of conversation with our panelists today by asking David, who has been involved in democratic work for most of his life in democratic assistance, and he's been the co-chair of the governance network at the OECD, a grouping of the 29 donors, the major donors, where there's a conversation going on right now about how to deal with this world we're in. And we're going to focus a little. Each panelist is going to focus on one of our 4 areas. And David chose the effectiveness word. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this effectiveness debate that you're heavily involved in, and what kind of lessons does it bring to the media development field? What do we learn about effectiveness by looking at the broader debate that's going on among the donors on this topic?
Thank you, Mark, for that question. Thanks for your kind invitation to be here today. I'm very pleased to be here and join this launch of the new CIMA website. Let me congratulate both CIMA in particular and the National Endowment for Democracy, both the programming side and the analytical side, for the tremendous work that they do on behalf of democratic governance and human rights generally, but on behalf of independent media in particular. You know, Mark, to return the compliment, Mark and colleagues like James Dean of the BBC World Service Trust are really leading lights in the international diplomatic discourse on development, media development, and aid effectiveness, which I will go into briefly. So congratulations for the strategic reorientation of the website. I surfed it this morning, found it very effective. I think the strategic goals or strategic challenges that you enumerated, effectiveness, sustainability, innovation, or funding, are exactly right, and it's a great way to order your work going forward.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about big E or uppercase effectiveness, and then pivot back to little e or lowercase effectiveness in the context of USAID's work. The big E is about the broader international donor discourse on it. So let me start with the big E and talk about media development in the context of the really 15-year-long debate now on aid effectiveness. And I don't know if many of you are privy to these international debates. We tend to be siloized in the development community, so make no apologies if you're not familiar with a lot of these acronyms and gobbledygook that I'll speak of, but I think it's important to understand the context that all of you work in, because we're all struggling as international activists to create the space, larger space for media development. So the big E, effectiveness. It overlaps in time with the debate about the Millennium Development Goals, which, as many of you know, derived from the Millennium Declaration, which world leaders signed in September 2000 at the special session of the UN General Assembly. The Millennium Development Goals were picked from the gorgeous, robust, strong text at the turn of the millennium, and they picked out, the UN officials that built the Millennium Development Goals as an instrument of poverty reduction and democracy and human rights. They took from that glorious text specific time-bound, concrete poverty reduction goals. There were 8 of them altogether, and they are expiring this year, so that's why we are debating the post-2015 development agenda. But the aid effectiveness debate grew up around the Millennium Development Goals, and the reason it arose goes something like this. The development enterprise, at least in the post-World War II version, had been going on for 50 years, ever since the end of World War II. Many, many donors were involved, of course, many, many NGOs, many, many organizations all around the world. Around the turn of the century and the turn of the millennium, people started looking at each other and said, let's get real and let's get more honest with ourselves in the international discourse. We are now beholden to achieve by 2020 these concrete 8 poverty reduction Millennium Development Goals. How are we really going to do development goals? And 5th was the principle of mutual accountability between donors and the host countries, that we were each accountable to each other, and we were going to, for sure, through the results and the targets of Millennium Development Goals and our own programs, make each other fully accountable for what we agreed to. So those were the 5 conferences and 5 principles. How does media development fit into that? In these 5 conferences and principles is what I consider, it's not termed that, but what I consider a core social contract. That is, donors say to the developing world, okay, you're right. You know, we've been running around with our heads cut off, we follow each other, we don't coordinate very well, we as donors, so we're going to let you be in the driver's seat. But in return, if we're going to support your strategies and your country systems, meaning your financial industry, budgeting systems, etc., then there has to be democratic ownership of your strategy and your development process. And that democratic ownership term is enshrined in the Busan Partnership Declaration of 2011. Democratic ownership is achieved explicitly in the Busan Declaration by bodies such as parliaments, local governments, and civil society writ large. It was a deep oversight not to include media, as Mark knows, in the civil society paragraph of the Busan Declaration. But we fought hard, and I fought hard with my USAID, alongside my USAID negotiators and our allies, to get democratic governance and human rights and democratic ownership into it. But I think we didn't get across the finish line. I fault myself for not pushing harder for the term of free media in the Busan Declaration. So that's the core social contract. Country ownership, yes. Country systems, yes. But democratic ownership, yes also. So media has not been explicitly mentioned. So this community lost the battle in Busan. In Mexico City, we tried to advance that agenda, both at the GovNet, at the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. We had Mark and James and others at forums where we talked about media as a key plank of democratic accountability and a broad democratic accountability system. We talked about, we brought the show on the road to Mexico City at the most recent conference of aid effectiveness. So we've tried to inject it in the discourses. At the same time, now the battle for this year, post-2015, Development Goals. The so-called Open Working Group of the UN has produced 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is a draft of the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals. And they include a combined peace and governance, democratic governance, human rights, rule of law goal in Goal 16. But we have not yet been able to insert media into it. The Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, to his credit, explicitly in his advice to the General Assembly that came out in a report about 2 months ago, he has said media freedom should be a core part of this basket of peace and justice goals. So we hope the negotiations will achieve what the Secretary General has envisioned in including media. So as I finish up my big E introduction, big E effectiveness, let me just say the challenge is to make media development an integral part, an explicit part of the Millennium Development Goals redux in the form of the post-2015 development goals, because only that will truly achieve the 5 principles and the work of the 5 conferences that have gone on since 2000. Briefly on the little e, how do we try and achieve effectiveness in USAID's media programs? Just a snapshot, as all of you know, we spend about, roughly by our count, about $120 million a year on media development. $40 million is on our core media development work as part of our democratic governance and human rights work. About $80 million is what we call integrative programs, so integrated into the social and economic sectors, health programs, agricultural extension programs, climate change programs, and using media or radio as a tool to advance goals and knowledge and information in those social and economic sectors. So it's about a $40 million with the core programs and an $80 million for the integrated programs. We try and, to put it very briefly, we try and advance effectiveness in our AID homegrown programs by trying to advance a 5-part agenda. And that agenda, as Mark on his new website intimates explicitly, all of these 4 pieces are intimately interlinked, and that's how we approach them. So in pursuing effectiveness of AID programs, we're also advancing innovation, sustainability funding as well. But the first thing we try and work on is to instill and provide the core journalistic skills in developing country journalists, whether they be a professional journalist or a citizen blogger alike. Second, we work on the political, legal, and explicitly democratic enabling environment of the media sector. So we work on the laws, on the rights that need to be encased in those media laws, and we work in supporting advocacy groups, human rights groups, media freedom groups to support a robust enabling environment. Third, we work on sustainability and explicitly helping media organizations develop the financial capacity and wherewithal to be financially independent and to really, for them to be able to achieve free media through an independent economic and financial base. Fourth, we very much, over the course of the last 2 decades, mix as appropriate new technologies with traditional technologies such as radio and TV. We've, as long, again, as 2 decades ago, we began incorporating the digital and new media into our programs. And that's a core part of it, even to the extent in closed and closing space societies, we work on providing internet security to bloggers and activists to stay safe in projecting their messages into their societies. And finally, we take, as I said, we take a mix of approaches to what we call perhaps intrinsic or media for its own sake work. Media as the true watchdog of democratic societies and open societies. Media is independent media is really the only purveyor of the free, open, and truthful information that citizens can use to exercise both their franchise and their ongoing participation as civic actors. And then we mix that with the truly innovative, important work of our social and economic sectors to get out the core information that people need to reduce poverty in their lives and to increase their economic and social agency as citizens of these countries. So let me sum up by saying some of the challenges that we face are mixed into this stew of fours. So one of the challenges is to mix appropriately the types of technology, to mix appropriately the types of intrinsic and instrumental programming, and to have a budget that makes sense supporting all of this work. One of the key challenges that we face is that our budgets are too little for the core work and too uncoordinated for the integrated work, meaning every sector has its own media training program for that sector rather than to have a more comprehensive strategic approach to the core training skills that will envelop all the social and economic sectors. So just a one-sentence summary, the big E effectiveness and little e effectiveness are both important to our work. Our little e effectiveness in the trenches every day along with your organizations and our counterparts in the developing world. But the big E debate is important to win in the post-2015 and beyond in order that we can expand the horizon and the sphere of the work that we all do together. Okay.
Thank you, David. You know, it's great that you were able to give us that sort of overview of the debate at the international level, because one of the things that came out from all of those encounters that we've had together in that process, and not so much from the U.S. side, but from the donors in general, is we hear from the international players on those stages that the media development crowd has not been as engaged as some other players on this whole stage. So say why, you know, to tell our audience why this matters. For example, why does it matter that there be the word media post-2015 agenda? What does it, you know, what does that, why does that, what does that change?
I think independent and free media to get in all these documents because, as Mark referenced in his introduction, there is a backlash against open societies, the so-called third wave that Chris and his colleagues chart through the International Forum here and the Freedom House charts and many, many organizations chart. Backlash against open societies after the cresting of the third wave is real. We all face it in our daily work. There are opponents of free societies. There are geopolitically strong opponents of those free societies embodied in very powerful countries. They are throwing their weight around at the UN and international fora of every stripe. It's important for the supporters of freedom, human rights, democratic governance, and free media as a part of all those things to make it clear to all governments that independent media is a sine qua non of democracy and human rights. Without free media, those larger goals cannot be achieved and certainly not fully achieved. And I think for that simple reason, all of you, all of us together need to be part of that discourse. We being a relatively small community, it's hard to have your voices heard in Geneva, New York, Busan, Mexico City. It's hard to afford the plane ticket there. But it's important that either I or my colleagues at AID or the State Department represent yourselves, show up, because otherwise, given this encroachment of authoritarian societies around the world, I think we will face greater backlash and greater retrenchment.
Thank you. I might jump around a little bit in terms of order with one we discussed. I might jump to Jeannie now to talk based on based on what you've just heard coming from David. You've been involved in this debate about media development really from almost the beginning. You've been at Internews, which has been a really key player in this the whole development of this industry, a very critical, decisive player in the changes that took place after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you've seen the movement from really successful and quite good work that really just blossomed in places like Poland and Central Europe in that period, to the more difficult environment that we're facing today. And I just wonder what your feeling is about where we're going now in this field. How prepared are we as a sector to meet the challenge of this less open world where even the technology and the business models that we're dealing with are so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the greatest part of our challenge is not only is the world outside of our world changing, but the world inside of our world, the little e effectiveness of the work that we do is changing so dramatically. I was asked to speak a little bit on the innovation piece, but it flows perfectly into
I wanted to give you
into this conversation, and I actually got a prop literally yesterday when I was preparing for this. Something came in the mail to me from our headquarters in Arcata, California. It's called Space Bridges, Television and the U.S.-Soviet Dialogue. And as an organization, we talk about our work with Space Bridges as the first big innovation that Internews worked on, which was lassoing the power of satellite technology to help reduce conflict around the world between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Sort of hilarious in this book, and I will actually literally pass it around because it's really interesting read. But at the very beginning, it talks about television and says how difficult it is to get messages of impact out because the media itself is just so flashy and shiny that people just can't focus on the message. And I'm thinking to Michael Brainerd, like, you haven't seen anything yet because our challenges now are so very much greater in sort of the media and information space. So I will pass that prop around. And the changes in the way we consume and produce and share, absorb information means that innovation needs to be in our DNA, and it changes the conversation, how we present ourselves and all of our issues. And I think what's really important on the innovation side is to remember that it's not invention. Invention is creating a new gizmo or a new technology or a new approach to something. It's about taking the best of all of that new information and ideas and making something more beautiful and making something more impactful and something more powerful. And so as a sector, we must constantly be striving to innovate because the forces outside of our sector and the forces inside of our sector are in fluid motion. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges because of the way the world feels today. I think when you think about it, I think our greatest innovation, the place we have to work on, is our strategy itself. So the theory of change hasn't changed, but our strategies are changing greatly. And I just heard my mic go off. In the old days, we had a sort of a media sector strategy, and we knew what we were trying to do, and it was a very straightforward approach of building a healthy media sector. Now, I mean, we've turned the question around, and we have to. It's like, how do we help communities meet their own needs so they can be healthy and in a robust community and society? And so turning that strategic question around really turns a lot of things around, but that's the only way that we can think about it. At Internews, we are moving away from using the word media development. We are talking about and have embraced an internal strategy of growing healthy information ecosystems. My second prop, why information matters, and Foundation for Resilience, but this describes what we are talking about as a healthy information ecosystem, including sort of these 8 factors to it and all of that, but I will pass this around. It's on our website, but it is about that looking at the flows and the dynamics and the fluidity of what's happening and focusing at a really human level on sort of what does it take to empower the individual, what does it take to empower the community with the information they need. And it's causing us...
Can I put it in the...
Yeah, go ahead and send it out. Particularly make sure Mark Koenig sees it because he will be particularly amused by it.
Make sure it gets back to Jeannie before she leaves the room.
Because of this changing space, we have to really start questioning our own assumptions, and it sort of drives, innovation is driven by sort of a new exploration of what we can do and what can have impact and what will change lives. And I'll give 3 examples of places where we're grappling with innovation or where approaches that we used to have changed dramatically because of this changing space. One is in Burma, and this goes in the box of what is old is new. And in Burma, clearly one of the most exciting places we can be working in the world right now, dramatic changes in the information space, lots of bad stuff, but lots of good stuff still happening. And our partners, who we've worked with for decades, are coming in and trying to start their own media outlets now that they can. They're able to register and they can start a media outlet. And we're, in our old thinking, it would be like, let's go and help these entrepreneurs, let's build their media outlets, and let's take them through a process of advertising and getting on social media, and that's all great. We're doing much of that, but what's happened too is that they've made a leap from, they want to build their media outlets, but they're also relying heavily on social media and Facebook, and it's causing terrible problems in the media sector, and we need to pull it back. And so what we're doing is saying, social media is great, but you must build a website so you can control your message, so you can actually build a market and control even your financial options. And so we're doing a thing where we're actually pulling back from the modern thing to something old that is much more important for them right now in this transition phase. And so that's sort of what is old is new in our approaches and our strategies. A second one is in the context of what we're doing in response to Ebola. Our traditional approach to working with media and addressing health issues is to make sure that affected populations have the information they need. It's very straightforward, the type of information they need. Places like Ebola and all over, the bucket here is information overload, chaos, information chaos. In Liberia and Guinea, where we've been working, that's the problem. Everybody can produce news and information, everybody can send SMS texts, and people are drowning in information. And so what's the strategy? Normally our strategy would be to do a very focused training program on the health issue at stake. Well, now we're creating an information dashboard to help sift through just this incredible amount. It's a very different help fill that critical role for the community, the affected communities, is how finding ways to sift through information as opposed to producing information. And the third example of changing approaches and assumptions driving innovation is in South Sudan, and this goes in the bucket of appropriate technologies. The high tech isn't always the right solution. We're working with internally displaced people in South Sudan because of the conflict there, and they are in IDP camps around Juba and all over the country, and they have very particular information needs. And our normal approach for refugee programs is set up refugee radio or set up a radio station for IDP camps. In this case, there's really very strict security concerns for these IDPs. And so we've had to go very low tech. We can't do the broadcast model that reaches everybody. That's very simple for us and is our standard. We're taking megaphones or we're taking microphones out in four-wheel little ATVs and driving around the camps with some music on to draw people to it, and then literally broadcasting the news via megaphone or broadcasting that way. And so it's that sort of high-tech, low-tech, the innovation. You need to think about what the best way to meet the very unique needs of the communities in which we're engaging. And that's our challenge, I think, as a community, because it's changed so much. I applaud what you're trying to do here. I think the areas that you're working on are very important, and I've sort of specifically some of the questions and the help that we need. On the innovation front, we need help sharing these ideas, these approaches, and sort of what the innovation is. You've always been very good at helping us share what's going on. The sustainability question is the holy grail in this new world. We don't have answers, and we were supposed to have answers, right? We're supposed to have the solutions, and we don't. And we are surfing it just like the world is surfing it, and we've got to work on this together. The funding, I think making the case for this has gotten a lot harder. I mean, because we're making both the broad development impact, not just the simple fourth estate argument, that's harder in itself, and particularly with some of the funders you deal with. But the chaos in our own world, it makes it, I mean, it is a little unnerving that we're saying these words that I just said now about how chaotic our approaches are and how they've changed so much. So it doesn't reduce the importance at all, but it makes the conversation a little bit more difficult, and I think your help and our help in coming up with the best ways to describe this. And the effectiveness piece, that human-centered design, the user sort of thinking about our design and the impact it's having at the individual and community level is just so critically important in our small E. I don't know if that's small E or big E, David, but I feel like it's both. Also thinking about different standards, given the nature of the work that we work in. There's ICT for D principles that I feel as a community we need to do a better job of embracing in commitments to some of these types of principles. So those buckets that you're helping us with, Mark, and this community has always helped us work with, just feel all the more relevant right now. So.
Well, that's a really good segue to Harlan, who has grappled with this sustainability question directly throughout your work at the NDIF, which I think is one of the more interesting models in this field of really trying to create sustainable, independent media in countries that that actually work in a way that is quite an example for others. And I wonder what are you taking from this conversation at this point?
So I think this focus on innovation. The focus on innovation, I think, is key to the moment that we're in. I like the way you're putting the focus on how communities use information. For us, we function as an, so we provide financing for independent media companies, whether it's loan financing or equity financing. And so we're very much focused on companies as a base of organization, as a focus of our effort. And we believe these are, oh my God, my phone's on. So we believe media companies are essential for creating information and processing it and developing it into a bucket of credible, reliable, useful content that people can use, right? And that can provide robust platforms for debate. The challenges that we've all heard about today already are real. The whole industry is in dramatic flux. And the question of what business models in the future and what can work today are really serious questions. I think Mark, before this, posed for me the question: is there any way for independent media to be sustainable in the future? And I think it's a question that can only be answered yes, no, and maybe, because it really depends on the specific country and the specific kind of medium. Television is different from radio, is different from print, is different from digital. And every country has a very different media economy. Some of them can support different versions of media that I've just went through, and some can't. And some might be able to, if not now, maybe down the road. So we've been, in recent years, focusing a lot on investing in digital media startups, because we believe that it's important to try to find models that can work in these environments. I think as time goes on, we are now starting to see models that have potential. So first of all, even here in the US and in the West, it's very recent that those models are starting to take shape. And you're actually starting now to finally see investment coming into digital media companies. We see that starting to play out in other parts of the world. Whether that will bear fruit all the way, because it's a very different environment here than it is over there, remains a big question. But we're seeing some interesting possibilities. The key thing for looking at digital media today is, going back to what you said, how does it connect up with people? In a way, it's very easy. The internet makes it very easy to publish. Anybody can go and publish anything, anywhere, anytime. What is a challenge is publishing information, creating information, and then connecting it with people, right? Because there's so many sources of information out there. There's so many pieces of content. As you said, we're flooded. Everybody is flooded with content. Creating an organization that has the capacity to both generate high-quality information and then understand how to distribute it effectively and how to monetize it, that's the challenge that the sector faces. That's what we are really trying to focus our efforts on moving forward, both in identifying who has the potential to do those things, and then how can we help them do that better.
Do you think this challenge that you're describing right now requires the same kind of institutional frameworks that exist for the traditional media, in terms of, one of the things that is still not constructed in most of the developing world is those basic practices and behaviors and laws, regulations and institutions that create a open system that is capable of operating in an independent way, that provides that level of sort of quality control and accountability and watchdog role and all of those kinds of things that come from that system. Do you think there will be a different kind of institutional framework for this new world that is coming now, or do you think it will still require those basic laws, institutions, and regulatory framework that?
I think all of those things will help a lot. You know, the enabling environment that we've all talked about for decades, you know, developing around the world, it remains, you know, I think a very important goal. But I think we all realize that, you know, if anything, there's retrenchment in different parts of the world. But it's not global. So there are parts of the world where things are advancing and getting better, and we can focus, you know, certain kinds of efforts where those opportunities exist. In other parts of the world, you know, I've always been impressed with the capacity of creative people to navigate those environments and find a way to produce credible information in difficult straits. I think that digital media represents as much of an opportunity as it presents a challenge. You know, you can do things that you could never do before. It, you know, lowers barriers to entry considerably. You can operate much more cheaply. There are opportunities to disrupt existing media sectors, you know, where there are very, very long-established players. Digital media creates the possibility to make change there. CIMA recently published a great report on Malaysia Kini, which
is outside there, by the way. I think there were copies on the on the table outside.
So it's a great example. Malaysia Kini is a great example, exactly how independent media on the internet can disrupt an existing sector and become a major player in a number of years and have a lot of impact and be sustainable over time. I think a big question for us is Malaysia Kini a unique instance, you know, born in a unique moment in a unique place, or does it represent a model for the future? One of the things that they've been able to do very effectively is build, you know, a real trust relationship with their audience. It's one of the things we think is key for sustainability going forward, where the more news outlets can actually rely on their audience for at least a significant part of their revenue, whether that's through, you know, subscriptions or paywalls or membership. You know, we think that's one key to sustainability going forward. And again, it goes to both not only how you create your content, but how do you community around you and develop that trust relationship.
Good. Okay. And going back to Jeannie, just to close the circle on the whole idea of the ecosystem for information. How do you think that that also requires those traditional institutions and laws that's not there, or
I think
does
it's both the institutions and some of the cultural norms. I think the word that we've said a number of times here, the word trust, and that's the root of everything moving ahead, and sort of how do you build trust. And so there's a lot of norms and codes of conduct that need to maintain to build trust. And I think the institutions, again, the pushback is there, but just enshrining freedom of expression, enshrining the free flow of information is critical. There are lots of very innovative people that are finding ways to get around it, but for it to be healthy and supportive and advance progress the way we know a media ecosystem, information ecosystem can, that piece is also critical. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of both those values plus the institutions.
Yeah, good. And you've written on the whole funding scene many times for CIMA, and you've been following this for years, and so you're probably the global expert on this topic, actually. I just wonder how you see this going in this environment, because there are signs that there's some pullback by the Europeans, and I don't know, you know, in the U.S. I think some of the foundations, there have been some questions about, you know, can we work in this environment, or are we having impact, and what are how do we measure whether or not it's working, and those kinds of questions have come up, and undermined. And a lot of the, the conversation that took place in Paris, the initial meeting at the GovNet that sort of spurred this. I remember maybe it's now been close to 3 years ago, there was a British representative there. I'm probably talking out of school to mention this. Came up and said, basically, we don't really know what to do in this environment. We are not able to invest in this in an effective way. Where do you see the funding situation now in this field, and where's it going?
Yeah, and I'd like to start with kind of thinking about my take on some of the points raised. When I started out in this racket 20 or 30 years ago, it was a lot easier. You had the free world and the communist world, and if the communist world only saw the light of day and had political and market freedoms and started good newspapers, everything would be fine. So a lot changed. We'll skip over that part. And the premise is much, much more complicated. And one thing that we've had is a light shown on what media is and can be. It's not just the relationship with the audience. It's also the relationship with the institutions of society, the state, but also market institutions, also religious, educational, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're missing in, I think, our overall conversation on the donor level and elsewhere is a clear understanding of the role of social values in the media and the way that the independent media is a kind of invisible mediator of the society's values. So if we read our media in the United States, there's the premise that it's not okay to murder people and steal from people and knock old ladies over with your umbrella. You don't have to state that all the time. It's embedded in the values of the institution of the medium. And as everyone who's worked in journalism knows, coming through a training or at a acculturation of every single institution, you learn those values, and sometimes you learn them the hard way. So here we have fruit basket upset, where within the last 10 or 15 years, all of our definitions about media have changed. All of a sudden, the acculturation, the role of the mediator of value, all of these are challenged and disrupted by digital media that says audience is creator, creators are audience. We don't know exactly who is what at any given moment. And by the way, this can create real problems. So when journalists learn how not to get sued from their editors, in whose interest it is not to get sued, there's a whole invisible institution there that creates a safe space for that mediation to take place. Yeah. The citizen journalist doesn't have that. They probably don't have a lawyer and staff. They really don't. They don't have people to manage their business affairs or to understand or explain these incredibly complex, new evolving markets to them. So now you have the donors looking at what used to be an orderly universe, and it turns into this incomprehensible hive of activity. And they say, where do we put money? What button do we push to do that? And there just isn't an answer at this point. So when I talk to foundation officers, what used to be simple portfolios, we spend $1 million a year on press freedom. Okay, that was kind of straightforward, and there was a finite universe of organizations to spend that money with. Now they're saying, well, but included in that is freedom of expression, digital freedom, access to digital media, response to surveillance, social messaging, ICT for D. Well, that's getting pretty infinite. And I think in response to that, there's a kind of institutional paralysis where they say, rather than spending more and more money with greater uncertainty, let's retrench. We're going to be in a period of confusion, and perhaps for the moment we have to accept that. And because many of these donor institutions are quite large and quite bureaucratic, it can take years to kind of reorient the portfolio. For me, this when I was doing a CIMA study and I was talking to the Ford Foundation officer and said, where does your media portfolio rest? In Mexico, it's in the folder. But of course, course. Right? But in Bulgaria, it will be quite a different matter. So right now you have this massive reconfiguration in these massive bureaucracies. And I also would like to talk about the donor community in three parts. So starting with the state donors, what I see there is in some cases retrenchment and questioning the spending of money on media because people aren't quite sure what they're doing. A few years ago, there was a kind of digital bandwagon, and everybody from the state donors and the private donors were just jumping on, the more digital, the better, let's abandon traditional media because we don't think it'll be around. That bandwagon has really slowed down, and now it's kind of parsing out sector by sector. What I've heard from my friends who are very familiar with USAID is that there is some movement towards spending money more on the mission level in country. And some people think that the administration is prone to direct funding towards crisis points. That would not be the United States alone. You see that with a lot of international donors right now, where when Egypt has a tumultuous period and there's a lot of public attention going to Egypt, you've got a lot of media funding flowing to Egypt. In that case in particular, you had problems with duplication and inefficiency. You can have too much funding going into an area at once as well as too little. So the numbers are also quite high with DFID, the British aid agency. The Cameron government has been successful in holding the level of overall development aid fairly steady, even though there's been public pressure to lower it. At the same time, you see in Britain and Australia and Canada a lot of movement that I would kind of call trade, not aid. So you've got a lot of aid that is woven into theories of economic development, especially when national companies are involved, national industries are involved. That may have certain implications for industries like mining and hydroelectric business. It's a very strange philosophy to apply to media because part of the bigger question we're facing right now is the role of globalized media, Anglo-American media, which has quite a dominant role in the world today, local media. So that whole area will continue to be very interesting. Other major players in this situation are the Scandinavians, or as my dear friend Francis de Souza would call them, the Scandawegians. Sweden remains a very, very large player in this field, spending about $30 million a year through Swedish CIMA. And that number has actually somewhat increased. However, CIMA and the other Scandinavian agencies, what I have seen and experienced doing this research is a very high rate of turnover. So given that a lot of this aid flows through foreign ministries or related organizations, you'll have extremely bright young people pulled from the consulate in Ouagadougou and put on the media desk, and they spend the first 6 months saying, what's media? Spend the second 6 months saying, I don't want to make a mistake. They get pretty good in the third 6 months, and then 6 months later they're gone, and a new person comes in. So this rapid rotation means that you have a kind of great response to national political issues. You also have a lack of experience among a lot of the program officers. You also have a kind of narrow, rather than studying media, they may be an incredible expert on Northern Africa. But when they have to work with a global media budget, it makes them very nervous. Now, it's especially interesting. OSF asked me to do an evaluation of the United Nations Freedom of Expression Special Rapporteur last year. And I was fascinated to hear the Scandinavians talk about the incredible importance of the hate speech issue in their countries these days. That was very much true for Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. They've had a number of incidents where hate speech, especially against Muslims and so on, has put has been incredibly controversial environment. And so that is being reflected in their interests in foreign affairs, how they look at media, how they spend money on media. There is a whole agenda going on with hate speech coming out of that region that's very interesting to follow. And the other outlier in state aid, which I can't call properly media development, is what China's doing. I was very fortunate in being asked by CIMA to do a report on China Central Television, which I thought would be a rather narrow subject, and it was not. Astonished by what I found in the course of my research. And I would say that, again, this takes us back to this critical issue of value-centric aid and development and thinking about media. Because what we would like to think, I believe, as Americans, is that if you have an open space for discussion and a free marketplace of ideas, you can have expression and the best ideas will rise to the top. This is not how the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee sees things. And they have a very, I think, surprisingly sophisticated approach to their media investments. They're especially important in Africa, which has a very weak media environment, very underdeveloped, very wanting in infrastructure, greatly lacking in last mile infrastructure. So when the Chinese come in, it's been with a soup to nuts approach, where they train journalists, they take journalists on junkets, they hire the best journalists in the market, they hire them away from the most prestigious news outlets, they build them a state-of-the-art studio, just look at the one in Nairobi, and then they pay them 20 to 30% higher salaries than market rates, and then they give them a great deal of leeway to do local reporting, and reporting on anything not of interest to the Chinese government. So there is this kind of atmosphere that feels pretty good until you come to the point of reporting anything that has to do with concerns of China, at which point the door closes. Now, there is nothing that I have seen that the United States or its development partners are doing on anything like a scale that China's doing in Africa, not even a shadow. And the sophistication of the approach to this market is stunning because, among other things, they're flooding the market with very, very low-cost cell phones and tablets, $30, $50, and in some cases building certain kinds of programs into the hardware and working in partnership with governments, some of which are not very democratic in their practices. So here is this incredibly powerful approach to working with international media, and I would say that the money involved, if you took all of the US and US partners' money spent in Africa and media and multiplied it, I don't know how many times, you wouldn't to what China's spending and what China is buying with hard currency. So I felt embarrassed having finished that report that I didn't know what was in it before I wrote it. Moving on to the private foundations, OSF is obviously the elephant in the middle of the room. We did have a turnover in the management of the media journalism portfolio recently. Gordana Jankovic, who did a tremendous job for a number of years, has stepped down. And the title of the program and the orientation of the program have changed dramatically. It is now the Program for Independent Journalism. I am told already that the levels of funding at $50 million should remain fairly constant. But here is where you're going to see a very influential and interesting, it looks like the new regime will be stressing independent journalism and investigative journalism in particular. It looks like it will be moving somewhat away from country by country focus and trying some new things. And it is very, very early days. The new strategies are not fully defined and authorized yet, but I would predict that investigative journalism will really benefit from this new stage of what they're doing. And I also feel that they'll continue their work in enabling environments, especially on the legal side, very much on the legal defense strategies. So otherwise, Ford remains an important player, $10 to $15 million a year from Ford. Some of that is going into their digital program. And again, you've got this uncertain line between content creators and audiences, digital freedoms, et cetera. And in many of these donors, you'll have surveillance programs worked into this as well. A newish player out of Europe is the Adesium Foundation. Now, we're going down from the 10 million level to the $7 million level at Adesium. And it's interesting to me to see that of the traditional foundations, Ford, MacArthur, for example, they used to be the big players in the room. And now they're not. They have been superseded by others. MacArthur is now at $1 to $2 million. Now, the exception to that is at $100 million a year, but it's really much more directed towards U.S. domestic journalism enterprises, and I think we'll be seeing a redefinition of their international programs. I think that they're in a transitional period that we'll hear more about. To go into the other part of the private donor world, it's very important to look at the new fortunes that have been created largely through the tech industry in the United States over the last 10 to 20 years. Pierre Omidyar's philanthropy has been around the $10 million level, so practically overnight Omidyar is standing shoulder to shoulder with Ford, which has been around forever, or at least 50 years. And we probably have all heard a little bit about Omidyar's forays into creating a news organization. There are a couple of things about these tech fortunes and their hedge fund cousins that I'd like to point out. First of all, when you look at a Ford or a MacArthur or an OSF, they're part of a community of philanthropies. They talk to each other quite a lot. They hire from each other. And I think they do, by and large, have a shared value system. Now, that value system has been somewhat hollowed out. The New York Times Foundation was small but influential. They closed their doors, don't exist anymore, because the New York Times pretty much decided it couldn't afford to have a philanthropy. The McCormick Tribune Foundation in Chicago was another one that was really a thought leader, especially with Latin America. They are sorely limited and not very present in the conversation anymore. Who's taken their place? The tech companies have started increasing their levels of philanthropy in the world of media, journalism, and digital communications. These boundaries are very fuzzy in two ways. One is the line between the company, the individual, and the philanthropy. So what is an eBay? What is a Pierre Omidyar? What is an Omidyar? What is the title? Omidyar Network. His wife has a philanthropy, right? And I find that these definitions are fairly fluid. I would offer as proof the fact that Google's philanthropy changes its name every 5 minutes, as well as its director. No offense, but it's hard to track them. Gates has been more strategic. They spend $1 to $3 million in media funding every year. Initially, they only saw media as a means to their development agenda, especially around public health and education. Recently, they've made forays into funding journalism more directly, then they've backed off, then they've backed in. They're still finding their way. They've got very bright people. And I respect the fresh thought that's coming out of the tech sector. I will hope that they will make more connections with the rest of the donor community and share more of the experience and the thinking, because I think right now there's something of a divide. And if you look at all of the money in the room, the new fortunes coming out of technology and the financial end of their operations dwarfs everything else. What I fear is that there is a new value system taking place in which civil society, as we've known it, is not very present. I'm seeing a community that takes shape in San Francisco and Seattle, which are both towns without a major newspaper tradition. And so you have people of a certain generation and a certain formation who don't necessarily believe in the traditions of American journalism as it has interacted with American institutions, and they're going to have a global reach that dwarfs anything we've ever seen before. So that's my overview.
That's a breathtaking overview. Thank you very much for that. I think everybody in the room was spellbound, and it's a very fascinating development. And just to put it in perspective, the Facebook paid $19 billion recently for an app, which is basically 50 times the total global spend on media development. I mean, so the size of those numbers that they are dealing with in those companies is just unbelievable. I think everybody's been sitting so patiently in the audience, and I think I better open it up in case there are questions or comments that people in the audience would like to make. Please feel free to ask on any topic. Or have any? Yes, introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm Jonathan Levy with the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. I wanted to see if anyone would be willing to draw some connections between sustainability and sort of the particular category of media. I was very struck by the discussion of investigative journalism and how one of the donors is focusing more and more on that, because from an economic point of view, and I'm an economist, investigative journalism is probably the one that is least likely to have sort of a traditionally sustainable business model. It's kind of a public good within public goods. So I was wondering if either you or Ann or Harlan or anybody else would care to comment on sort of what are the categories that are sort of most likely to get to sustainability, and those that might need assistance for a longer period. Thank you.
Do we have another question we could take at the same time, or should we just take that one? Oh, here, right here. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist and a journalist. I've worked in Central Asia and Myanmar not long ago. A question about the media or the information ecology and the issue of generations. Of course, older folks can learn to love social media, but there's also something to be said, as you did, about the traditional media, or the legacy media. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and how in different environments, social media shouldn't always be wagging everything and the prime focus of funding and attention, because there's a role for print media. Sometimes people have something that they can look at and refer to, and when the current goes out or the wired opportunities diminish, there is still something to hold on to.
So Harlan, why don't you take the first question and we'll pass.
You want to take that one?
Yeah.
It's all yours.
All right, maybe we can split it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a huge question. Investigative journalism is expensive and time-consuming, and traditionally it was subsidized by other parts of newspapers. And I think in a way the future sustainability of conducting investigative journalism in a commercial media company on how sustainable, how profitable other arms of media companies can become, and whether it can revenue to once again subsidize the cost of investigative journalism. It's a big question, but I think the The other question I have, which, both here and in the rest of the world, is to what extent there will be other kinds of bodies that are doing investigative journalism, and and then they depend on other media to circulate. We're already seeing it now with things like ProPublica and many other institutions. And that's one likely scenario, and it's the nature of the future of media. It's actually connecting people with all of these much more original sources of reporting and professional sources of reporting. At human rights organizations and academia, many of them can produce much more authoritative reports than a newspaper can, right? Where most journalists are not experts in their field. And in the past, it was very hard to connect people with those original sources. Now it's very easy. So actually weaving those together is, I think, part of the puzzle and part of the power of digital media going forward. In the countries where we work, it becomes a harder question, because the philanthropic support for investigative journalist institutions, certainly local support is hard to come by. I suspect that's one of the things that has driven OSF to move more in that direction. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, and I'm especially interested in the question coming from someone from the FCC, because obviously a lot of the glory of the U.S. television news era, which I believe is sadly over, was a result of a regulatory environment which required a public service component, and saying, if you're going to make all of this money with your serial advertisements, you also need to give people independent news. And I think the same spirit was behind the creation of public broadcasting, which has been another crown jewel of American broadcasting and journalism. And fortunately, NPR has been able to carry that forward. So what has happened, I think, has been partly a failure of our regulatory environment from the last 40 years or so to defend the public interest, the public good within the public good. Now, what would happen if some really creative, benevolent people said to Google, you're making all of this money from ads, now you have to create independent news production to defend your occupation of that commercial space. Say it to Google, say it to Facebook. That was kind of built into the whole concept of postal subsidies for journalism to start with. But we lost it along the way. And not only that, we've created creatures that are cannibalizing the people who are giving, donating their labor to create content. And that is kind of a perversion of the market in many ways. So the problem is that as the US market system has collapsed through these multiple factors, the rest of the world is following in our wake. I was just in Spain. Their newspapers are on the verge of bankruptcy. When they go down, their quality news websites go with them, because they're the ones writing the news that's on the websites. And in a lot of developing countries, newspapers are having a kind of surge as literacy and incomes rise somewhat, but they're going to take the dive too. So what I see a lot of happening in media development is kind of, fiddling around with the edges and not really getting to the heart of the problem. I think the regulatory environment and deep market restructuring is the only way around this.
I find hope, and often I'm a big optimist in this sector, despite all these challenges we're dealing with, because it is a public good. It is, this type of information is a public good, that some of the sectoral or even the philanthropic moves to maintain it, you definitely are feeling a resurgence of worry about this problem in this country and internationally. And so I do feel like some of these structural changes could come. I'm going to sort of move and segue sort of in the countries that we work. Investigative journalism is very challenging and very difficult. There are openings that are really interesting. The opening of data around the world has created a whole new profession of data journalism. It's not as in-depth as investigative journalism always, but it does open up new venues, and it's very difficult. We work with journalists all around the world for them, help them interpret, scrape, tell stories from data. there's nothing easy about it, but it's a whole new opening towards answering some of these really critical questions, and we're seeing a lot of movement, enthusiasm, and excitement there. So again, another positive spin there. I want to go to the question on sort of demographics and gaps in sort of as this sector is moving so quickly. We did a study of Japan in the post-triple disaster Japan and the information ecosystem, what happened. We work and look at information media in humanitarian crises a lot at Internews, and we were just curious. Here's the most media savvy, one of the most media savvy countries in the world. What happened there? And how does it look compared to what we saw in Haiti or what we saw in post-tsunami? And it was fascinating. It was the demographic issues that were the most critical issues, because so much of the communications moved to social media. Huge numbers of people were missed by any information on humanitarian response, on where aid, and the disaster took out everything when it comes to infrastructure. So you also lost at the most needy communities had nothing, no information. Newspapers or actually social media sites and radio stations started writing on walls, like every day coming and sort of in IDP, in places where people were converging, and sort of writing the news on walls so that people would have any source of information whatsoever. So the demographic gaps are real and must be addressed. Over time, they will change, just like everything changes. But that is where we see some of the worst gaps in information and healthy information for communities, and particularly vulnerable communities, and one that we're thinking a lot about.
Yes, let me provide 3 comments, 2 to the specific questions from an AID perspective, and the third, taking out my AID hat and just sharing some provocation. The first, Jonathan's question, from AID's provincial perspective, we certainly see investigative journalism as an enterprise that needs to be subsidized, and so we see it as an important part of democratic transition, important part of anti-corruption activities, and we recognize financial sustainability, particularly transitional ones for that. To Mindy's question, I don't have much to add to that excellent question, to add to Jeannie's answer of her South Sudan example. I think we and my colleague Mark Koenig in the audience embodies this as one of our old media and new media experts, is that we bend over backwards in the old phrase, try and implement a strategy of appropriate technology. So whatever is needed in rural Africa, African communities, we use as much radio as anything, because that's what's accessible to people. And so we're very much into appropriate technology, notwithstanding our embrace of social media and digital media. On my own personal provocation, I think Anne asked a profound question in her introductory remarks about whether the balkanization or diversification or anarchization of media in its traditional sense, both in developed and developing societies, has led to an alienation or a delinking of the media's relationship to the state, to the market, and to religious institutions and other fundamental bulwarks of traditional society or even modern society. And what are the consequences of that, and what are the consequences for our practical work in that? I'm of 2 minds. On the one hand, I grew up refugee from China. I was acculturated in terms of American social values in the 50s and 60s by the avuncular news hosts Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley. I bemoaned the loss of that. I still don't know what to do with 1,000 cable channel. I don't listen at all to the so-called echo chambers of cable, because it's too far from Uncle Walter for my taste. At the same time, as a professional in this field, not as an AID officer, I think sometimes, and particularly me as a refugee to this society, I can romanticize the role that traditional society played as a conveyor belt of social values and as a conveyor belt of democratic information needed for democratic citizens. I would argue, when I embody the other side of this spectrum of debate, the view that bet money that democratic citizens in new or advanced democracies today, if they're discriminating, educated consumers, can get a lot more from what's available in our democratic societies than what I could get as a young refugee listening to the nightly NBC News or Walter Cronkite and even his white paper shows, etc. And so I think we can go overboard in romanticizing the role of traditional media and bemoan the horrendous, divisive, hateful role that new media can often veer towards by not recognizing the great abundance of information that democratic citizens can use to enact their citizenship on a daily basis.
You wanted to come back?
And I agree with you that for the educated, cultivated citizens who have access to the globalized cornucopia of information, it is a far better world, especially since that education involves how to assess media. I'll just cite two examples. I grew up in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is addicted to the cable news channels, more of one kind than another. And I've watched the erosion of fact-based dialogue, of informed debate, when it permeates society. And in the world of Uncle Walter, there was a kind of buffer against certain kinds of expressions, certain kind of unfounded arguments, a buffer that's pretty much gone and has also wandered farther into hate speech on more occasions than I would think. And I'm not saying that the educated, most cultivated, most informed people in the state, but they are people who are making a difference in the national landscape. I see the same thing going on in Hungary, where for a while there was a kind of interesting establishment set of voices that was in a transitional period, and as those newspapers and broadcasters have eroded and lost their audience, lost their market, etc., extremism, hate speech, and some very ugly manifestations have arisen. I don't think it's a total coincidence. I'm not saying it's cause and effect, but I do think we're in a very dangerous zone. I work a lot with education, young people, and all you have to do is look at the comment section on YouTube and look at how much time young people spend on YouTube versus traditional media to see that we have a new social environment taking shape, and we should be aware. That's all.
Well, listen, on that happy note, we'll call it a debate. Everybody's ready for a glass of wine or whatever, and I want to thank you all for coming. We have things coming up at CIMA to address almost all of these questions. We're about to do an event over at the Governance Hub here in Washington, focused on nonprofit models for media. We're preparing a report on the role of the GovNet and OECD institutions that one of the OECD officials is working with us on. We're also doing a series of donor profiles. So we're going to be filling in more and more of this space, and I want to thank you for a really thoughtful debate. You guys all were really interesting to listen to today, and I thank you for coming, those of you who traveled, and David for coming over and filling us in, and it's always great to have you, and we want you to come back again. Thank you very much for coming. Join us for a glass of wine.